Hello, we're outside the wall, and today I'm here with Wally and Abeldex,
Hello. Hello.
and we're going to be talking about an Argentine film called The Dark Side of the Heart by Eliseo Subiela, originally titled El lado oscuro del corazón. This film opens up our Argentine and Canadian production fortnight. I believe this will be it for the introduction, so let's start with the opinion of you, Abeldex.
Okay, so before I start, I want to make two disclaimers. The first is that this is a very poetry-based film in Spanish, and I'm not even remotely fluent in Spanish. And reading translated poetry is a little bit like judging a dancer's performance after both of his legs have been cut off. Secondly, this was a film where I found myself alt-tabbing out of it quite frequently, just because it was difficult for me to cope with the sort of boredom and frustration that it gave me. So I may have missed certain important aspects of important context that would have made me reinterpret the film. So if what I'm about to say makes me sound like a colossal dumbass, well, it's because I'm a colossal dumbass, but that didn't help. So now this film is can kind of serve as an introduction to Latin American poetry, with particular emphasis on the works of Mario Benedetti and Oliverio Girondo, of whom the latter is sort of reinterpreted as the main character of this film. And the former actually appears himself in the film, reciting some of his poetry in German, interestingly. And it even kind of relates to, so two of those guys, as well as Juan Gelman, whose poetry I think is used, are not really contemporaries of one another, as far as I know. There was a time in history when all three of them were working, but Girondo precedes both of the other two by a significant amount, and Benedetti outlived the other two by a significant amount. And I don't think there's a single movement that unites the three of them either. Girondo worked for some time on a magazine that helped usher in what's called the Ultraist movement, which I don't know much about, but it was likened to the more French Dada movement of around the same time. For any viewers who aren't familiar, I talk about this too much, but the best way to summarize Dadaism is with a particular work from that movement, specifically Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, which is, you'll probably know as the time that a urinal got placed in a fancy art gallery. And while I can appreciate the societal commentary that is inherent to something like Fountain, I don't find it very compelling as a work of art. And I think there's a certain extent to which I see that in this film as well, particularly with the work of this sculptor character who is a friend of Oliviero and is working on a display of basically a bunch of giant stone dicks. That seems a little bit pedestrian to me as a sort of, like subversive art form, especially in the 90s when this came out. For example, actually, in A Clockwork Orange by Kubrick, is an adaptation of the book. There is a sort of a mocked character of a sort of pretentious older woman who has a marble phallus in her house, and the main character beats her to death with it. So that was kind of already a pedestrian, middle-class, phony art in the 70s, and it was even kind of taken further in its offensiveness by Kubrick by having Alex beat to death this woman with it. And I think, for me in general, the use of metaphors and symbolism in this film are not very well developed. For example, the main character spends a lot of time talking with the anthropomorphized figure of death as a woman. And most of the conversations, as far as I can tell, between him and Death are pretty much the same, which is that Death will try to get him to live a sort of more normal life and pay the bills, and he'll just berate her constantly while she sits there with a sort of placid expression on her face. I think that's just not a very sophisticated metaphor, because the intention behind it is to show that sort of normal life is itself a kind of death and compromise that the protagonist doesn't want to take, although he does eventually take it. And it just kind of doesn't really reveal any additional interesting dynamic or layers as it goes on. So I think this film could actually have been significantly shorter than it was, just because there's a bit of redundancy in scenes like that. As an introduction to some of these Latin American art forms, it's not very compelling to me. It makes me think maybe I just wouldn't like them very much. So I think I would recommend actually that people just engage with the works of someone like Benedetti or Girondo firsthand and skip out on this movie.
So I guess it's my turn then. I didn't have such a visceral. First of all, I didn't alt tab out of the film at all, so I did enjoy it enough not to do that. for me, this very much, I think I will agree that when you're talking about poetry, particularly in another language, when it gets translated, it sort of loses its allure. And throughout the film, the main character uses poetry a lot. And in English, the dialogue can sometimes come off as a bit stilted. But I think nevertheless, there is some sort of cinematic poetry behind what's going on in the film. I, for one, do enjoy the sort of back and forth between the main character and the personification of death, and how it kind of is a commentary on the life of the artist, and especially in modern times today. I think maybe for me, the weak point would be not just that translation of the poetry, but the camaraderie between what I call the Three Amigos, the sculptor, the poet, and their other compatriot who happens to be, I think, living and traveling. I think he is traveling from Canada and visiting Argentina. And they kind of are going around and trying to get food, basically. But overall, I think the story was interesting in the way that, even though I find it somewhat unrealistic in how the main character sort of buys his way into getting food and getting like hotels and stuff through his poetry, it's very much almost somewhat comical to me to have him like walk up to a food stand and just start reciting poetry, or walking up to a bank and like the rest of the people are looking around like, what the hell is this guy doing? Is he all high? Is he okay? I think I would agree that I think if for a viewer to get a better appreciation of Latin American poetry is to probably look at the poetry first before coming into this. But I think there are some themes in here that are worth considering and worth talking about for me to at least enjoy it enough.
Yeah, so this is actually my second time watching this film. I was the one that pitched it. In a way, this we have been, our next podcast will be about this other Argentine film called Secret Wedding, Boda Secreta, which we've been talking about, meaning to watch for like 2 years now. So which is also an Argentine-Canadian production. So I found a good film to pair it with, at least in Argentine context. I very much enjoy this film. I quite love it. I have the benefit thought that I'm Latino and Spanish is my native language. And I was also familiar, at least before I watched this film for the first time, I was already familiar with Benedetti. He's not Argentine, he's an Uruguayan poet. He's very famous. Quite a lot of his works are recited even here in my Honduras. And I do agree that it is certainly better to be familiarized with this kind of work before watching it. I just had the cultural benefit before it, but and I do agree that translating poetry does damage it. I've experienced this actually the other way around, that I read some English poems in Spanish first when I was a kid. So, for example, to give example, a very different type of poetry would be the Garon's Poe's The Raven, El Cuervo in Spanish. I actually read that poem first in Spanish before I even knew about the poem in English when I was a kid. And I do agree that it does change. It's kind of like it loses a bit of its shining features, but I think it's still good to appreciate it in its value. I'm quite actually fond of Oliverio, and that this film also showcases elements of magical realism to it, which is actually quite a common theme, I say, in Latin American works, especially literature. And I believe we mentioned this before, like Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez is perhaps the most prominent work of magical realism in Latin America. I actually quite enjoyed a lot of the interactions between Oliverio and that. And I would say that it also not touches on the themes about the artist itself, but also the themes of romance and love that he's dealing with. There's a scene where they in a cafe.
Intervengo en casos de amor, aunque a veces no sea justo.
El amor nunca puede pasar por tus manos. La justicia nunca puede pasar por tus manos. Aunque se mate en nombre de la ley y aunque se muera en nombre del amor.
And he tells that even if they may kill in the name of justice and people may die for love, that itself will never really understand or have love. That itself meddles in the lives of Oliverios and love's life at times. Quite like that part theme is that is actually also, I would say, a common theme in Latin American lands. There was the comment that had been mentioned about the works of art from part of sculpture, which might seem pedestrian, but I think that it is also important to take into the context the fact that this movie came out in '92, and Argentina not long after that, it is quite a common recurring theme in Latin American countries. They have gone through years of dictatorship and then 2 years of democracy, but the democracy is quite let's say, conservative and very radical. And Argentina today is, I would say, a more libertine country, even among most Latin American countries. And I think it's important to take into the context about what they're also trying to achieve in that sense, about the kind of liberty, freedom, and expression that has been limited by censorship and the conservative ideals that, in that case, what they call menemistas, that came from the presidency of Carlos Menem. That's something important, I think, to view when thinking about it, because, well, I'm also not really a fan of that kind of art. I can appreciate what it is trying to achieve in that kind of society. I quite like this film. I quite like this. There's a bolero being used in a specific scene. They call it Algo Contigo. It's quite a famous Latin American bolero, and I think the use of that song also ties in thematically with what's been going on. The lyrics say that no quisiera yo morir sin tener algo contigo, which is I wouldn't like to die without having something with you, roughly translated. It's probably not the best translation, but I think this also showcases what we were trying to mean about the translation of a poetical work. But I think I quite like this film, so I think we can start discussing more about it.
Yeah, so I think I would agree with the sculptor's artwork, and knowing also, it would also know to help some of the background that is in Latin America, especially during when this film is made. As you mentioned, most of Latin American countries were under dictatorships during this time period, or just coming out of dictatorships. And each of these authoritarian regimes were also married very closely with the Catholic Church. And I think this art form that the sculptor was using, even to one point in the film, the sculptor was saying he was going to display it in front of a church, is basically this kind of middle finger to the power authorities that had basically abused and stamped down on any kind of radical dissent that we now in, say, like America or the rest of Europe would take for granted. So I think that's also important.
And another thing you can bring up to sort of give him some due credit is that these people like Benedetti and Garando were working mostly in the early to mid 20th century. So if we take this version of Oliviero as sort of an equivalent to the original, then that sculptor would have been working earlier in history as well, although he still, I think, would have been preceded by things like the Dadaist movement. But still, I think from a filmmaking perspective, that kind of just came off as a sort of shallow contrarianism, and I get enough of that from you two, frankly.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I think it's there's also almost towards the end of the film where they pick up a theme that Oliverio himself have told Death about how poetically and beautiful it would be to have the demonstration of love defeating death. And the sculptor himself makes the comment about having this quite controversial sculpture idea about Jesus having sex with death and the defeat of death through love, and how Oliverio himself actually makes the comment that he won't be arrested for that, he will actually be crucified.
Cristo haciendo el amor.
Sí. Y en la última de las obras, Cristo cogiéndose a la muerte. La muerte, agarrada a su guadaña, abierta de piernas, con los ojos abiertos, desorbitados. Y Cristo encima, sereno, con los ojos cerrados, venciéndola. El triunfo de la vida sobre la muerte a través del amor. ¿Qué te parece?
Que esta vez no te van a meter preso. Te van a crucificar.
Yes, and the irony behind that.
Yeah, I think one thing I picked up on during that scene is the use of the word love there felt a little strange because it almost fails to recognize the distinction between love and sex. Although I think in general, this film clearly does recognize that distinction because the main character keeps going to bed with all these women that he doesn't really love.
Well, I guess maybe, Raim, you could comment, being, I know that you've stated before that there's very many ways to say, or different ways to say love in English and for a Spanish language.
Yeah, that's actually a complaint that I have with the English language. Is the fact that there's not really a word to separate like degrees of love. There's actually a lot of lines within the film where there's, and actually in this film that we just recently watched, the Boda Secreta, which they don't really use te amo, as in saying I love you, but rather te quiero. And there's the degree of love that querer is in, querer could almost sometimes be literally translated as wanting, but it is not used also in that sense of wanting, but rather in the sense that you may love someone, you can querer someone, not necessarily romantically, but just like in a degree of affection. You may querer, yo quiero a mis amigos, I love my friends. And if I told a friend yo te quiero, I know that they won't take it romantically or sexually, but rather they know that what we are meaning about this. The Spanish, the Italian language, I know also has this with ti voglio bene, ti voglio. And I believe that there may be other languages that do so the same. At least in the Romance languages that in the right, they probably have it too. I can't speak about French because I don't know French, nor Catalan, or Romanian, but I mind they do have so too. And I think that actually the words that are being used there is more. It's actually one scene that I quite like, and I think it's very memorable, which is the discussion with the dialogue there is between Oliverio and his ex-wife. She asks him about if he loves someone. He said that it is hard actually to love, and how hard it is to love without actually giving anything in return. And the ex-wife makes a comment that we make sometimes that mistake about loving someone not for what they are, but rather for the ideal that we see in them. And that when we really realize that, we may be too late.
Well, I do think, I'm going to stick up for my native language here, I do think there are different ways to signify degrees of love in the English language, but I think because of the modern culture, it very much has gotten watered down to where the word love is used kind of too much, to the point where people use the word love to just when they're talking about inanimate objects like love of country or love of some kind of cuisine, where I think traditionally speaking, and I could be talking out of my rear here, but I think linguistically that wasn't the intent of a word like love.
Yeah,
I would agree that I think the Romantic languages in general probably have a much more verbose examples of different degrees of not just the word love, but in many other words in general.
Well, with the case of love, that would be why they're the Romantic languages, I suppose.
That's one way to be it. Yeah,
I've never been bothered by the apparent ambiguity of how the way love is used in this language, although I can see why it would be stranger to somebody coming into it from another language. We do have expressions like platonic love that signify a very different degree of love compared to romantic love, as we call it in this language. But there may indeed be a more linguistically elegant way of differentiating those.
Yeah, and I think this is also a detriment to just the translation of poetry in general, is that I think part of the reason why maybe this might come across as weak or very ambiguous is because if the fact we're talking about something that is poetry and is probably, at least in my view, the one art form that doesn't do well translating into other languages or other forms.
Well, or at least the art form that suffers the most from translation.
Right.
Prose language can also suffer quite a bit from being translated in various ways, depending on both the style of the translator and just the complexity of the language used in general, but in poetry in particular, the arrangement of the words and things like that are very, very important. So
Yes, particularly when it comes to rhyming poetry.
yeah, even a good translator can find it almost impossible to really translate something in a poem and maintain the beauty of the language, let's say.
Indeed, I do agree. As I mentioned, I noticed it's actually the other way around, being that from English poetry to Spanish, how different it can be. But I noticed when we were watching the film that the subtitles, that it does change quite a bit, and it's, I think, something sadly that's kind of unavoidable due to the limitations of it. As we were all becoming polyglots and didn't have to experience in any kind of media without subtitles. But I still think it's good to give it a chance, despite the film is very poetical in nature and in its dialogues, and thus experience will be hindered by it. In translation, I think it's still worth watching.
Yeah, so another thing that speaks to the cultural differences between perhaps North America and Latin America, or perhaps just between you and I, Rain, is the fact that for me, I don't really hold this against the film, but I did find it pretty off-putting to see poetry recited as a form of pickup line.
Mi táctica es mirarte, aprender como sos, quererte como sos. Yo puedo perdonarle cualquier defecto a una mujer, menos que no sepa volar. Te propongo construir un nuevo canal, sin exclusas ni excusas, que comunique tu mirada atlántica con mi natural pacífico.
And I'm not entirely sure why, but there's just something that really doesn't sit right about that for me. I think you can use arts to sort of win lovers, as it were, but the way that the main character in this particular film does it kind of degrades both the art and the women to me.
I actually don't see any kind of problem with it, and I actually mentioned in the past to both of you that there's this lyrical form called bombas, which are bombs, and there are basically short poems that are being used to basically pick up lines.
So does that work? Would you say?
Yeah, I say that works. Yes, poetry is actually
from personal experience.
From experience.
I think part of it for me is that he just, as soon as he sees these girls, he immediately goes up and starts right out with the poetry. I think it would be more palatable to somebody in my culture, perhaps, if he talked to them a little bit first and then sort of steered the conversation towards the fact that he's a poet, and then hope that they would ask you to give him an example.
I think that speaks more about the style of, let's say, conquest, in a way, a conquistador that they're doing it.
That might not be the best word to have chosen in case any feminists are listening.
I'm not saying it's actually limited just to, not even to feminists. I recently watched this movie called The Love Witch. It's a 2016 film about this woman, Elaine, who practiced witchcraft in order to gain lovers, let's say. And she has this method in the film where she doesn't really say anything, but she has this intense gaze. And it's kind of like saying that the men fall for her at first sight the moment that they catch her gaze. And I would say that in a sense, Oliverio is also quite intense in this regard, but he has this style set down about his poetry and what he's going to be reciting. It might be, as you mentioned, quite a cultural gap. I'm not saying it might work on a Canadian woman, but...
well, the best way to romance a Canadian woman is to do really well at hockey, actually.
But it is actually quite well accepted in Latin American culture in general. It's very passionate, very open and emotional. I actually believe we discussed this in the past, perhaps in a previous podcast, about how effusive and how actually physical Latin Americans can come in comparison to more Northern Americans. The issues about how it may be common here to salute someone with a cheek kiss, kiss each other's cheeks and salute with a hug and such. Even someone that you might have just met, while this perhaps may not be quite as good as, let's say, approaching a woman in perhaps Canada with a cheek kiss.
No, that would probably get you arrested in this country.
But as I mentioned, it is quite a lot more open here, and I had seen no problem at all in using the poetry the way it is used as a way to flirt and woo someone.
Well, I hasten to mention that even if we accept it as a problem, that still isn't really a valid criticism of the film, especially because the film does kind of delve into the, I suppose, problems or dissatisfaction that come from the way he treats women in a way, or the approach that he takes to romance, you might say. Because at the end of the film, he's pretty dissatisfied with everything after his prostitute leaves him.
I think actually that's not how it ends. Oliverio's final monologue is actually saying how Anna has left him so rich, and he wonders why she left and chose to be poor, because in a sense he did fall he did actually fall for Anna and would have wanted to stay with her, but she was gone, and he was left with the richness of the experience that he had with her, and that she was capable of making him fly.
Yes, I would agree with Raim's view. That's how I picked up the ending.
I do agree that he does, but there is a progression throughout the film about the way that he treats women, and how he was at the start just very well, and like when they got like too close to him or they weren't capable of making him fly, he just threw them down the shaft. But
yes, he essentially cut them out of his life.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And there's actually a point where it is shown that he does not do this despite the woman not making him fly with the blind girl, and how he hesitated to do it, and even when he never meets her again, he was a point, a stepping stone for him to no longer just cut them out ungracefully.
Yeah, I do have to say the whole flight metaphor in this was another one that I found kind of tiresome, just because, again, it doesn't really reveal new dimensions for the most part. It's a pretty obvious metaphor, and that combined with the comedic way it was delivered made it kind of smarmy to me, I think.
Maybe. I mean, when it first happened in the very opening scene, I first thought we were dealing with sort of this like psychopathic murderer who like something straight up saw, but I was very quickly proven wrong.
Yeah, that scene kind of set the tone for the rest of the film for me. When I saw him like first reciting that poem that he repeatedly does, and then doing that, I was like, oh, I'm not going to like this. But I will say that one part I did like, that I did at least find satisfying with that whole thing, was that when his prostitute leaves him at the end, she presses the button and dumps him. Mm-hmm. The reversal there was satisfying, definitely. Although I think that's partially just because I really didn't like Oliviero.
Yeah, I know you didn't. I still go ask myself about that, but as I mentioned, I think that speaks not just perhaps the cultural differences, but the difference between you and me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Well, I think one thing maybe we might have in common, the three of us, on this is, I know, X, that you had brought this up during the film, that some people might view Oliviero as a simp. And for those that don't know, in the modern discourse, that essentially means someone who tends to fall head over heels for girls, but then doesn't realize that girls, like females and women, have their own desires and needs, and when they do not clash with them, they get their essentially get their hearts broken. They take too seriously a lot of the overtures and different things that girls might give them is too serious. I think this is the example of this is in the very fairly known meme of the guy who says, oh, she looked at me, I think things are serious.
Yeah, well, one particularly simpy action of Oliviero's character, to give credit to that, I guess, is the fact that he goes to such lengths to hire this prostitute. I think he ends up kind of betraying his artistic values to a certain extent by going with the agency in order to make enough money to spend 3 nights with her, right? And of course, the prostitute, as with most of some of these more submissive guys, takes the money and leaves in the end. Although in the film there is supposed to be a sort of genuine romantic connection between them. So that particular character action, I think you can kind of brandish with that insult.
I wouldn't say that Oliverio is a simp. So I think what you're talking about is almost towards the end, where she fakes that she's having sex with someone. Is that the scene that you're referring to?
Just in general, his decision to really work hard to make all this money that he can then spend on her, essentially.
Yeah, but I just meant because in that scene, she doesn't take his money and leave, because she actually tells him that he can pay, she should pay her afterwards. But when he goes to the apartment, she's just faking it, so he doesn't enter.
Yeah, so she basically lies.
Mm-hmm. She didn't swindle him out.
It's a very, I guess, 90s version of ghosting.
Yeah.
Yeah, honestly, I think the whole pressing the switch and lowering them into the floor thing is still less abusive than ghosting.
I would agree.
It's a bit more. It's more direct after all. No, but I as I mentioned, I wouldn't say Oliver is the same. I think you are misunderstanding that term.
No, I would agree. Well, he's not.
No, I don't think he's really a simp, but I think he does have a few specific actions that partially showcase the characteristic people might associate with a simp. So he's like he's like a quarter simp or something.
I think you're trying to stretch it now. Well, then, you were going to say?
Yeah, the one other thing I think maybe we can discuss a bit is what I would at least constitute as the magical realism or the metaphor in the movie, which would be primarily the tit for tat between Oliviero and the personification of death, which is played by essentially a woman dressed in black who kind of follows him around and observes him and kind of teases him into his, or tries to tease him out of his current lifestyle.
Yeah. As I mentioned, I think this is also kind of a very nice representation about the god woman that follows him. She think there's the case also that this is not just Oliverio himself seeing that, because there's actually a sequence where they're in a cafe and she tells him that it's going to take that guy to the afterlife, let's say. He's dead. And she's bringing the guy and some kids through the passage. I think the representation of death itself is actually also very, perhaps also, I think we made a comment that it's not perhaps as common, at least in then, as a woman. The more classic representation would be the older man in a hood and with the scythe. This is a bit more modern take, let's say. But I think also at least in Latin American folklore, there are mentions more of the thing is that Spanish is a very gentle language. So muerte is actually a female term, let's say. Because you say la muerte, you don't say el muerte, you say la muerte. So perhaps this also helps see why death itself in Spanish is seen more as a female figure.
Well, my interpretation of it, at least in this film, was that Oliviero was basically seeing kind of his own, what he doesn't want to see in death, which is in this case is a woman who doesn't appreciate him for his artistic merits, but just wants him to live a like a normal life.
I saw you correct yourself on the quote unquote.
Yes, I caught myself.
Yeah, so it's definitely a metaphorical use of death. In particular, death represents the temptation, almost you could say, to sell out, to kind of either monetize his artistic endeavors more aggressively, or even give up on them and try to live a more stable, financially valid life, however you might phrase that. And that's associated with death, basically just to give it the very negative connotations that Oliviero sees in it. And again, I didn't think that was very sophisticated as a metaphor. And I think it even kind of robs the concept of death to a certain degree of the weight that it should carry. And now it can partially be done intentionally, because it could be about making a message that death is mundane, which to a certain extent is true because of its omnipresence in the world.
Maybe for me, it could be more just a metaphor of death of the soul rather than a literal death.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we have nothing else to talk about then.
Probably where we should end it.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end it. And so to summarize, this is, as far as I'm aware, this is kind of a cult film, the 90s in Argentina. Was this only the only Eliseo Subiela film that I've seen, but there's actually another one that I'm interested in that's also stars what was the main character of the film that we'll be talking next, El Secreto, Secret Wedding. I think this is very poetical and quite beautiful work. So I know that the cultural limitations and the inherent damage that translation of poetry brings can hinder the experience. I still think it's worth giving a shot, and I say that his session itself showcases the good range of opinions and differences that there are between the three cultures involved watching this film. If you're definitely interested in Latino culture, then perhaps this is definitely something that you should look into. And yeah, thank you for listening to us, and see you next time.